And then we're recording. Welcome, Rosann. Welcome for our third session.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I hope you are all well and staying safe during this time of COVID. Thank you again for inviting me to walk with you during this Lent. I want to take a step back before we take two steps forward to just remind us of where we've been. In the last two sessions, we looked at Deuteronomy 26, and we looked at the distinction between the lament for the dead and the lament of affliction. You'll recall that the key takeaway, or I hope the key takeaway from our study of Deuteronomy 26 was that it condenses the way in which the ancient Israelite religious imagination came to structure all of its narratives about God delivering them, which is to say, whenever in the course of their history they experienced deliverance from God, when they told the story, regardless of the details of the event, when it happened, how it happened, who it happened to, so forth. While the details differed, the structure was the same. It was always put into, you know the structure now, right? The structure is this. There's an experience of suffering. We cried out to the Lord. The Lord heard our cry. The Lord saw our affliction. The Lord delivered us from our pain to a place of safety. And in response, we praise God for what God has done for us. That's the structure that the ancient Israelites used to preserve the Exodus, right? Which was the foundational event for the Jewish people. So while you can read the long version of that in Exodus 14 and 15, you can't memorize that, but you can memorize 5 verses in Deuteronomy. And in the ancient Near East, it was always important to know where you came from. So when asked by a different tribe, who are you? The response of the ancient Israelites was, let me tell you my story. My father was a wandering Aramean. We went down into Egypt. And then that's, and you know what follows. So the reason I want to emphasize that, and I can't overemphasize it enough, frankly, is because that very structure, every component of that structure, not only did it become the way in which the ancient Israelite community preserved all of their stories about deliverance from God, but because that structure becomes the structure of the prayer that we're going to study, which is the prayer or the Psalms of Lament. So that's the reason why I set up and began with Deuteronomy 26. So that's point number 1 of what we studied. Point number 2 of the second session, I tried to make the distinction between the lament for the dead and the lament of affliction. And you'll recall that the lament for the dead was a backward-looking dirge. It doesn't ever refer to God, and it doesn't have any hope in it. It's a prayer about something that has happened that cannot be fixed. It is broken, it is finished, it is dead, it is over. In a sense, the feel of the lament for the dead is that we don't have any hope that can be anymore. And the clearest, and by the way, it's not coincidental that there are very, very few laments for the dead in the Hebrew Bible, which ought to tell us something, even before we know a whole lot about this, about sort of the the instinct of the ancient Israelite mind, right? The most famous of them you know or have heard of, I'm sure. It is How the Mighty Have Fallen. And you may recall, by the way, that that is the part of that lament is what Ronald Reagan used when he talked about the Challenger blowing up. That very phrase, how the mighty have fallen. And that's a perfect example of a lament for the dead, right? They're not coming back. That's not happening again. In a sense, the best is behind us. So that's where we were. That's where we've been. I hope you are reminded of all that and can move forward with me in this session. And in this session, I want to introduce you to the collection known as the Book of Psalms, within which one finds the Lament Psalms. Remember that, if you will, the Book of Psalms is a collection of prayers. Actually, it's a collection of collections. I'll say more about that in a minute. The origin of these prayers is lost. We just don't know when they were written, where exactly they were written, or by whom they were written. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But what we know, or what scholars tell us, is that they were preserved, right? While the details of them are gone, where, when, why, who, that's gone. But they were preserved likely within the liturgical life of ancient Israel. So they were songs sung during liturgies, during various kinds of liturgies. In terms of the dating, that's really, really difficult because it is a collection. What we know is there were probably many, many, many more than 150 of these prayers. These 150 came together in a book, if you will, a collection, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. But most likely, the collection came together at a really important moment in the history of ancient Israelites. And that is during the Babylonian exile. You'll recall that the force of Babylon and the armies of Babylon wanted to conquer Israel. And what they did was Jerusalem, not Israel, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, because it was a port, right? It was a port city. It's on the Mediterranean. And so what they did was it's a walled city. Those of you who have ever been there you can still see portions of the ancient walls of the city. And what the Babylonian armies did was they surrounded the outside walls of the city and they shut off the water supply. What that meant, and they did nothing else. And they did nothing else for between 2.5 and 3 years. What that meant was that inside the city, the inhabitants of Jerusalem died of hunger, died of all kinds of diseases, died of thirst. Bodies had no place to be buried because you couldn't bury them within the walls. You had to bury them outside the walls. They couldn't be buried. So it was a most horrific experience. When the armies of Babylon thought that the people had been wasted, they breached the walls. And when they breached the walls, the people who were left, they mostly slaughtered. They raped the women, they brutalized them. And then they forced marched this small group of people some 1,000 miles from Jerusalem to Babylon. And that's known as the Babylonian Exile. That takes place around 587 before the Common Era. And that group of people remain in Babylon for about a generation. They are Cyrus, the king of Persia, overcomes Babylon. And one of his first acts is to say to these captives, you can go home if you want to. You can return to Israel, to Jerusalem if you want to. Most of them did, not all of them though, because it was already a generation. There were kids growing up and what have you. The point is this, that it is during that time, between 587 and 534, in that 40-ish period of years, when you have a small group of people, if you can imagine this for a second, what is in their memory? The devastation of what they saw and what they lost. They not only lost personally, wives, husbands, children, parents, they lost their city. And as you know, Jerusalem wasn't just a city the way Baltimore is a city. Jerusalem was the place where the temple stood. It was the primary locus of where God's presence resided, in the Holy of Holies, in the temple. When the Babylonian armies breached the walls, they also destroyed the temple. So now you have a small group of people in an alien land, without a home, with the memories of that they carried with them, without a city, with this extraordinary question, religious question: where is God? If God doesn't, God, we know where God lives, the presence of God. The presence of God is in the temple. There is no temple. We are not in Jerusalem. So our losses are mammoth. They're staggering. And if you will, did I just do something here? Hold on. Am I okay?
You're good. You're good.
I think I hit my keyboard. I'm sorry, everybody. But what I wanted to do was I wanted to get my Bible, because I wanted to read you a very short psalm, which you all know. But the setting for the psalm is what I just described. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat. We sat and we wept as we thought of Zion. There on the poplars we hung our lyres. Our captives taunted us. Our tormentors said to us, for our amusement, why don't you sing one of those songs you used to sing in the temple? And then line 4, verse 4. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? That's the profound theological question that these survivors were struggling with. We're on alien soil. How can we sing a song when God's presence is not with us? How can we do that? And then the line, but if I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate. If I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in my memory, even at my happiest or most desolate hour. So you have a sense, I hope, of what the exile was and was like, a little bit at least. What scholars tell us is that there is a growing consensus that it was precisely during this time that this broken people said, well, we have no temple, so we can't perform any liturgical services. We don't know where God's presence is residing now. But what we do have is our memory of the prayers that we prayed. And it is out of that they collected these 150 psalms. There were, we know, many, many more, but this is what they remembered. And this is what they preserved. I love that story, by the way. Mm-hmm. And I love it because it gives us an insight into the power of people who, in the midst of profound deprivation, survive because they chose not to die. They survived and they changed their theology, right? And it was a pretty prevalent, staid theological reality. God's presence is among us while we are in Jerusalem and the temple is standing. Now, they could as easily have said, well, I guess that's it for us. We're not in Jerusalem. We're on alien soil and there ain't no temple, so it must be finished. But instead, they did this remarkably creative thing. They said, no, we remember who we were, and we're going to preserve what we can. And in the preserving of that memory, that kept them alive and identified as a people. So when in 534 Cyrus said, you can return, these exiles returned with the memory of what was, with the power of their prayer. And in the process of that, came to believe that in some mysterious way that they couldn't understand and made no theological sense to them, that God was there. God was in their midst in the exile while they were praying these prayers that they knew, that their grandmothers and grandfathers and mothers and fathers taught them, that they remembered from their time in the temple. So that's the setting for the collection, for the putting together of the Psalms. The last thing I want to say about that whole piece is you will notice, and many of you have already, that many of almost all of the Psalms begin with some reference to David. Well, what modern scholarship tells us is that David was not the author of these Psalms. That it is likely that these prayers were written over perhaps 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Some way, way, way back in when the first temple was first built in 1000 before the Common Era. Some later in the 600s, 700s, 600s, 500s. The reason authorship is ascribed to David is that was a very common thing to do in the ancient world. In fact, it was common up until the Middle Ages, before the emergence, if you will, of the individual, of the I. If you wanted something that you wrote, I mean, it's true in art, it's true in music, it's true across the board. But if you wanted to give some gravitas, some importance to something that you wrote, you would put the name on it of a famous person. That was very common. And everybody knew that. Everybody knew that. That was just a common practice. So what we know is that David was a very important character in the history of ancient Israel, right? And so the Psalms, most of the Psalms get ascribed to his writing. But what we know from the evidence in the Psalms themselves is that they were written over a very long period of time, probably in different parts of ancient Palestine. One last point about the dating of the Psalms. One of the things about the Psalms that's so remarkable, and we'll see this when we study the Laments in particular, is that there's very little specificity in them with regard to place and time and people. they're almost generic in their language. And they're quite poetic and metaphoric, and we'll see this in our next sessions. But the plus side of that, and I'm convinced that one of the reasons they endured as they did and became timeless was because they weren't specific. that they were timeless, literally, that there wasn't specificity in them. So, for example, when the psalmist cries out, "Help me, O God, because the waters are up to my neck, because I am drowning in sorrow." Right? Who can't identify with that? You know, who among us hasn't had that feeling, that sense of not being able to survive, of being overwhelmed and overtaken? That psalm can be said anytime, any place, by anyone who feels overwhelmed, who is not going to make it if God doesn't hear them. And so that's the beauty of the timelessness of the Psalms. Modern scholarship has assigned specific genres to the Psalms. Some of them are Psalms of praise, some are Psalms of thanksgiving, some are Psalms of confidence. A large chunk of them are laments. Roughly, Psalms fall into three categories, however. And those of you who know the author Annie Lamott, and those of you who don't, you should introduce yourself to her. She's a wonderful, wonderful writer. A few years ago, she wrote a book on prayer, the title of which was Help, Thanks, Wow. Right? Help me, God. Thank you, God. Wow, you're terrific, God. In a sense, she captures precisely the three genre of praise, of thanksgiving, and of lament. Those are the three large brackets of the Psalms. The last point I want to make here is the following: that perhaps the underlying assumption, in fact, it's my underlying assumption, having studied the Psalms for as long as I have, the question that always kind of haunted me when I was in graduate school and writing my thesis on the Psalms was, why did they preserve them? Why did they keep them? I mean, in addition to what I've said about the only way they could stay connected. But the other reason, and I think it's especially true of the laments, and I want to try and argue the case for you in sessions coming up, is that what the ancient Israelites came to realize was the potential efficacy of these prayers. What do I mean by that? That they worked. That somehow these prayers made a difference. That they were effective, if you will. That somehow in the process of praying them over and over and over again, something happened to the one or ones praying them. So the efficacy of prayer, especially of laments, is something I want to leave you with, because it's something that I want us to delve in much more seriously when we talk about the way in which the Psalms of Lament are structured. But for now, I think I want to stop. And Martha, what observations or questions do you have?
Well, there's always so much when you give a teaching to comment on. But what I was thinking about while you were talking is how, although we're not in a Babylonian exile, we're very much in a kind of exile. And what we've done, particularly the thing that saved me during this is being able to actually go to my temple, I suppose, but also to do the liturgical songs and prayers. Now we haven't done them. We've done a shortened version of those. So I think we've picked, well, what's the most important thing that we should do in these particularly evening prayer services?
Right.
And so a lot of them are the Psalms. We have a small group that sings the Psalms every week. And we pray, we do the prayer list, and we use Holden's Service of Light. So what we're mostly doing is scripture, homily, and singing of liturgical materials. So one of the things, so I was thinking about that. And then I was also thinking during this period last summer, our historic wall that takes you all the way up Washington Street. It's quite long. It's the size of a football field or so. It had been leaning, it's a very old wall, over a century old. And it fell one Sunday afternoon after a lot of rain, kind of in late spring. And so we had been going back and forth. What do we do? What do we do? What do we do? Do we do anything? And we hadn't done anything, and it fell. So we, very slowly, all things came together, and we were able to put it back together with a modern retaining wall behind it. But one of the things I was thinking about when we were putting the plaque on it was, well, what do I put on the plaque? And Psalm 121 came to me, and I was thinking about this generic nature, because that's kind of we're on the top of a hill. Emmanuel is. You can see us from Interstate 68. You can see us from downtown. And it's kind of the icon of Cumberland City. They use our image on all their materials. So, but I thought I used these 3 lines from Psalm 121. I lift up my eyes to the hills. From where is my help to come? My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And then I went down to 8. The Lord shall watch over your going out and your coming in from this time forth forevermore. And so people walk up and down the street there, and I wanted them to see that as they were walking up and down. But Psalms, that was what, it was so generic, but so what we wanted to say about the wall and the church and the community. So I just wanted to see your comments on that.
Yeah, that's just a great example of, or a great story, I should say. It's a touching story.
Uh-huh.
I couldn't agree with you more. When you think about what do we carry in our little religious toolkit? Mm-hmm. And I worry about us as Christians, what's in there. Mm-hmm. If it so that whenever you're in need or whenever you're flustered, you open it up, what do you pull out? Well, if the only thing you pull out is Psalm 23, and that's nothing against Psalm 23, it's a beautiful psalm, right? But if that's all that you know, how poor are we? When the fact of the matter is, we have such a richness of prayer within the book of Psalms that articulates all the places in our lives that we live, the different moments in our life. And so part of my great hope in introducing people to the Psalms in this way is to give them much more to put in their little sacks that they carry around with them, so that they can say, oh, you know what? Psalm 121, that's a perfect psalm for here. Or Psalm 69, save me, God, I am drowning. Nobody wants to have that in their prayer sack. But when you're drowning, you want to be able to pull that out, right?
So out of the depths I call to you, is that 130?
Yeah. So
I think
Augustine's favorite prayer.
Yeah. So this week, I believe that the choir, our little recording choir, we've attempted to do Stanford's Out of the Depths I Call to You. And I believe that that's what we're using, but we've used different musician and composers' renditions of that. And it's all about crying out to God. It's all about lament. And Dr. Scott Reeker, our choral director, has really been plumbing the depths of all of our traditional kind of canon of music. And a lot of it is, it's there. We don't sing it a lot, but it's there, and composers went to it a lot. So I think of Elijah too, Mendelssohn's Elijah. There's so much that is there. And the one that we're doing by Stanford, it's, you know, the organ is, it's a very clashing, dramatic piece. So anyway, I just, we're trying to bring more of that into the toolbox.
Well, I think, you know what, I think the other thing I want to say before we close, your comment about being in exile and pandemic, I think is such a rich and important analogy to make, because this is a time of testing for us in some way, a time of desert. Isn't it coincidental? It's a second Lent, where we're asked to make some pretty important decisions in a time when we're all exhausted. Right? How do we remain alive? Not just breathing, but how do we remain alive and connected? And, you know, I meet with a group on Zoom. It's not ideal, but we study texts together. Right? I pray together with a group of people on Saturday afternoons, because it's a way of saying, damn it, I am not going to let this change. It is changing who I am. It's changing who each of us is, no question. But I'm going to do what I can to remain alive in the midst of this. And I think that analogy, Martha, I think is just spot on. That what we have in exile is our memory, right? In the midst of loss, we have memory. And the memory, in terms of religious memory, the religious memory that we want to hold on to is the memory that God has always been with us, right? That God has, in the midst of all of our exiles, from the first to however many there are yet to be, we don't want them, but they're there. But God has never left us. And so that memory, in the midst of loss, that memory is, I think, what gives us hope for the future. And the Psalms, I think, are a great tool, a ready-made tool, if you will, for that. So thank you for your attention, and I'll see you next session.
Yes, thank you, Rosann. This has been wonderful.